Was Ronnie Van Zant's death the end of Lynyrd Skynyrd? It's a question that comes with a lot of controversy, and is something that people still talk about 47 years after his death, and they'll talk about it for many more years to come. So we're going to try and get some insight and come up with answers ourselves. So stick around. The plane crash which ended Ronnie's life also took the life of guitarist Steve Gaines and his sister Cassie, who was a backup singer with the group. The rest of the band members who did survive took a very long time physically to recover. Some never recovered from it mentally, but they did go on to play and record again. 10 years after the crash, they put the Skynyrd tribute band together. It was only supposed to be for one tour, and it still goes on today here in 2025, even though no original members are in that group. Yes, people still love those songs and pay money to hear a live band perform them. But the point I'm after here, did the band die along with Ronnie Van Zant, goes a bit deeper. At the time of Ronnie's death, the band had pulled together, hiring Steve Gaines to take over the vacancy left by guitarist Ed King, and were starting to climb back up the ladder. And yes, they had been down a few rungs of it around the time Ed King left the group. Album sales started dropping. The Second Helping album had sold 2 million copies. After that, Nothing Fancy in 1975 sold a respectable 1 million copies. And after the departure of Ed, the Gimme Back My Bullets album barely sold 500,000 copies. So as you can see, Skynyrd was trending the wrong way in record sales. So then they filled out the third guitarist slot with Steve Gaines. They created that great live album, One More from the Road, and then Street Survivors, which was to be their last album. The album was an instant success, achieving gold certification just 10 days after its release. It would later go on to double platinum. The album performed well on the charts, peaking at number 5, the band's highest charting album. The singles, What's Your Name and That Smell, also went up the charts. The album was released on October 17th, only 3 days before the plane crash, and I'm sure that boosted sales early, but over time, Street Survivors went on to sell 2 million units. It was by all standards a great album with some very strong songs on it. Even today, it ranks just under the Pronounced album by only a few thousand copies sold. So how these albums were created were basically the guitarist usually wrote out and played the structure of the song, and Ronnie came up with the words, phrasing, tune, and some arrangements. So the whole idea of this video is, did the Lynyrd Skynyrd band die along with Ronnie Van Zant? After I go over this a little more, I'll give you my answer. But right now, I can say the name sure didn't. It still lives on with the other musicians playing the songs even today. The music? Well, the Rossington Collins Band and the tribute band had many of the same players who sounded like they always did. And to their credit, the Rossington Collins Band did release an album that went gold, but broke up soon after that. So to get to the bottom of this, we need to dig a little deeper into who the complex Ronnie Van Zant really was and what others had to say about him. As a kid growing up in Jacksonville, Florida, Ronnie's heroes were Muhammad Ali and Mickey Mantle. Ronnie loved playing baseball and had a desire to become a boxer at times. He also loved to fish. It seemed to have a calming effect on him. Ronnie's wife says that when Ronnie would come home from touring, he didn't drink, just hung around the house and was a great husband and father. He would take time to go out and fish, but he seemed to separate himself from the band while at home. Guitarist Ed King recalls rehearsal time at the Hell House practice facility in the early years that sometimes, while the guys were working up a song, Ronnie would grab a pole and head to the water behind the house and fish, all the while listening to the music coming from the house while relaxing a little. He would then come back in with more of those great lyrics and song arrangements that he will always be known for. Fishing for him was a way to recharge his batteries. While writing the song Saturday Night Special, Ed went on to say, "I could have died." I said to myself, how does he come up with the stuff that's so cool like that? How he came up with the subject matter he did, or his angle on the subject matter, he was just a raw genius. That's all there is to it. Ed was to leave the group right after this. It was told Ronnie held a lamp with a busted bulb in it to Ed's throat, threatening him for some reason or another. After leaving, Ed said some of the band called asking him to return. Of course he didn't. Had Ronnie called him, he most likely would have returned to the band. It's a well-known fact that Ronnie could become a handful when drinking, and sometimes downright dangerous, and nobody was safe around him, friend or foe. So I'm sure that made it pretty easy for him to lay off the booze while at home and around his family. But around the band, it was a total different story. Drummer Artemis Pyle had this to say: "Ronnie was the most loving, caring guy you ever saw. He would give you the shirt off his back, but he could be mean as a snake when he started drinking." It was Artemis who would finally restrain Ronnie that night in Hamburg when, in a drunken stupor, he turned on his longtime friend and founding member Gary Rossington and cut both of his hands so bad he required stitches in both of them. Ronnie, after busting a bottle over the tour manager's head, knocking him out for no apparent reason, turned on Gary and said, "I'm going to cut your hands and you're never going to play guitar again." And as quick as that, he began to carve on Gary's hands. It was Artemis who finally restrained him while Alan Collins took Gary to the hospital. This happened about 2 years before the plane crash. Bob Burns was the drummer and a founding member of the group, always speaks with high respect of Ronnie. Bob, who was kind of fragile mentally, left the group right before Ed King. A few of the band members say Bob just couldn't handle Ronnie's drunken rants. Alan Collins said that Ronnie was like a big brother to him at times, and then like a father at times. Of course, the whole band boozed and drugged, but you don't hear much about them getting violent or dangerous like Ronnie did. Ronnie did go as far as to hire his longtime friend Gene Odom to go out with them to try and help curb the drinking and partying within the band. And sometimes you have to wonder if Ronnie did this for the band or more for himself. Gary Rossington has stated numerous times in interviews that the band playing as Lynyrd Skynyrd is a tribute band. He says they want to keep the band's and Ronnie's songs alive because he feels that's what Ronnie would have wanted. So I said in the beginning of this video, I'd tell you my thoughts on if Lynyrd Skynyrd died along with Ronnie Van Zant. And of course, you can have your say too in the comments section. Ronnie Van Zant was the leader of Lynyrd Skynyrd. And if he is a great leader, I'll leave that up for discussion. But what we do know is his bandmates loved, feared, and respected him. Ronnie was also the lead vocalist and frontman. Was he a great frontman and vocalist? Again, we can leave that up for discussion. For my 2 cents, I say Ronnie was the only vocalist and frontman for that band. He fit the mold perfectly. And last, and probably the most important factor, though not given as much credit as he deserves, Ronnie was one of the greatest songwriters of his time. He could reach down inside himself and come up with some great lyrics and place them into the music and then deliver them on stage and in the studio in a way that just grabbed your heart. You know, after someone dies and is gone forever, sometimes we put them in a different light. Now, Ronnie wasn't a hero, and he wasn't a villain either. And he was a very complex human, like we all can be at times. His friends and bandmates both loved him and at times feared him, and they had a valid reason for both. Ronnie was the oldest, and he was the leader of that group from the very beginning, and they all looked up to him. The name Lynyrd Skynyrd lives on, but the heart and soul of that band, in my opinion, died on October 20th, 1977. Gary Rossington. Alan Collins, Ed King, and Steve Gaines were all great guitarists. What they accomplished as individuals, songwriting and performing, was outstanding. But the key to making Lynyrd Skynyrd the iconic band of the 70s was how they worked together to create songs and a sound like no other. This video is not going to be a case of who was the best guitarist in Lynyrd Skynyrd, but how these guys performed, took the best of their talents, molded it all into one, and created some of the greatest songs and sounds in the history of rock, or southern rock music, or however you want to label Lynyrd Skynyrd's genre. Gary and Alan were there from the beginning. Ed was brought in a little later, and when he left in late 1975, Steve Gaines stepped in to replace Ed in '76. But it was these four guitarists who played a major role in creating the legendary sound of Lynyrd Skynyrd. Of course, they were all very good individually, but what was the secrets that caused them to work so well together and create that distinctive sound? Well, I've got my theories, as I'm sure many of you do too. So let's jump right in and see what we can agree or disagree on. First off, I think one of the most overlooked talents of all four of these guitarists was they were all fantastic rhythm guitar players. And I don't mean that in the sense of just strumming chords. I'm talking about grinding out a groove on an electric guitar. Sadly, we only got one studio album with Steve Gaines on it, but between that and taking over for Ed and playing on the live album with only about a month or so to get ready shows that Steve had the same quality of being able to carry a song playing rhythm along with the others. All four guitarists could solo and play slide, of course. But I really think those rhythm parts blended together, live or in the studio, was something you just don't find every day out of three guitarists all playing at the same time. As I said, Steve Gaines only had about a year and a half with the group before he was killed, along with his sister Cassie and the group's leader and frontman Ronnie Van Zant in the 1977 plane crash. But there is no doubt he left his guitar sounds all over that final album, titled Street Survivors. What's even more impressive to me than that was the One More from the Road live album, which was recorded in 1976, and Steve had just a little over a month to get ready for this. His abilities to fit in shine all over that album. He picked up where Ed King left off and did a fantastic job of keeping the great three-guitar steamroller going. I expect we'll all be in Steve's shadow one day. This kid is a writing and playing fool. He's already scared everybody in the band into playing their best in years. Those were the words of Ronnie Van Zant. And from what his other bandmates had to say about him, the praise that Ronnie gave to Steve Gaines was very well earned and deserved. After Ed left, the band sort of cruised along in party mode. Not saying they weren't performing well, maybe they were just too comfortable and needed a kick in the hind end to step it up a bit. And that kick came in the form of Steve Gaines. He was a very talented guitarist, vocalist, and songwriter that made the other six members sit up and take notice. He had a great future ahead of him in music. As an individual, he was very talented, but he also had that special something that let him step right up in between Alan Collins and Gary Rossington, where Ed King had been, and kept the Skynyrd sound going. The proof is in that live album, as Ed King was no easy act to follow. Ed King will always be known as the guitarist who created the iconic guitar riff introing Sweet Home Alabama, but he was much more than that. Starting out as the bass player at first, Ed took over those duties when Leon Wilkeson had left the band and took a day job at an ice cream factory. Ed did a decent job on bass, but Ronnie made the decision to move Ed to guitar and get Leon back in the band to take over the bass guitar duties. So at that time, Ed, who had played guitar in the psychedelic rock band Strawberry Alarm Clock, owned an early 70s Les Paul Deluxe and decided if he was going to play guitar in the band, he needed to get a different sound, as Alan Collins and Gary Rossington were both playing Gibsons, Alan a Firebird and Gary a Les Paul. So Ed took that Les Paul and traded it in on a new Fender Stratocaster. This would be the guitar he would write that iconic opening riff to Sweet Home Alabama on, which Ed says was written the first day back at practice with Leon on bass. Now here's Ed's take on the three-guitar band. He said, "I think the three guitars, all being different, helped. We weren't really that great of musicians, but we worked real well together. There was a great chemistry. Live, people really picked up on that. We really enjoyed playing together." Now I have to say something here before we move on to the other two guitarists. And this is about my feelings on Ronnie Van Zant. I've always thought Ronnie could write lyrics as good as Chris Christopherson and phrase them like Merle Haggard. Ronnie Van Zant was one of the greatest songwriters of the 1970s, and I don't think he ever gets enough credit for that. I guess maybe his stage persona overshadowed it. I don't know. Now, Ronnie didn't play an instrument when writing songs. Ed King said he'd sit on the edge of the couch at the Hell House practice space, pretty much with his head in his hands. He never wrote anything down, ever. So we'd work real hard to make sure we remembered the groove of the song, how it felt, and the changes. Because if you came back the next day and couldn't play it with exactly the same feel, there was a good chance the song was lost. So this is another reason why these guitarists were so important to those Skynyrd songs. Ed ended this by stating, Ronnie wrote his syllables so that they fit inside the groove. As I said, Ronnie could phrase like Merle Haggard, except he phrased his around the electric guitars. And many of those early songs were around the sounds created by Allen Collins and Gary Rossington. Allen Collins will always be known for his ripping solo on the end of Freebird, but if you pay attention to his background play, he had a very unique style of holding down the rhythm section. Allen never had any guitar lessons, so to speak, just picked up things here and there, but he was a natural, and it wasn't long before he was playing well enough to form a band. Then a year or so later, he was to hook up with Ronnie Van Zant and Gary Rossington, and along with drummer Bob Burns and bassist Larry Junstrom, formed a group that had a few different names, such as My Backyard, The Noble Five, and The 1%, before finally calling themselves Lynyrd Skynyrd around 1969. Allen, along with Ronnie Van Zant, was to be credited with writing 3 of the 8 songs on Skynyrd's first album, called the Pronounced Album. The songs were Tuesday's Gone, Gimme 3 Steps, and Freebird. Allen would go on to write the music for many more great Skynyrd songs. Now there is one song from the very early years I think you should give a listen to, as not many know about this one, titled Need All My Friends. It was written by Ronnie and Allen Collins. If you listen to this song, you feel the roots of Lynyrd Skynyrd starting to take hold. Listen closely to the rhythm going on in it. I'm going to leave a link in the description section to a recording of this song. If you've never heard it and are a Skynyrd fan, take my advice and check it out. Although the recording and the mix isn't great, you can still hear Allen and Gary doing a great job getting that Skynyrd feel on the guitars. Gary Rossington will always be known for his slide work on Freebird. He is also credited, along with Ronnie, for writing 3 of the 8 songs on the Pronounced album, I Ain't the One, Things Going On, and Simple Man. Speaking of which, wasn't a favorite of producer Al Cooper. During the recording, Cooper didn't think much of the song Gary and Ronnie had written called Simple Man, and said it wasn't very good and didn't want to waste time on it. Legend has it, Ronnie Van Zant took Cooper outside and told him if he didn't like the song, he could just stay out there until it was recorded. Ronnie walked back in the studio and the band laid down the Skynyrd classic. Here's what Gary had to say about the writing and recording of Freebird. Around 1970, when we wrote the song, I had just started playing slide. Allen had these chords, but Ronnie couldn't figure out any melody or lyrics to go with them. We kept playing the chords over and over until Ronnie figured out some lyrics and I came up with the slide part. But when I played, the bottle kept clinking against the frets because the strings were too low. I took a screwdriver of all things and stuck it under the strings up at the nut so it would raise the strings up like a steel guitar. Then I tuned the B string down to G. So the G and B strings were both tuned to G. With the two G's, it created a drawling double sound. He says he still sticks something under the strings to this day when he plays the song live. Not because he had to, just because he wants to. Gary was to write many, many more Skynyrd classics. Actually, all of these guitarists have left their fingerprints all over these songs. Just because their names aren't on the writing credits doesn't mean they weren't involved in the writing and putting the song together. All of them were so very important in laying down the music and feel which gave Ronnie Van Zant the vehicle he needed to create and tell us stories in the form of all these great songs. If you're enjoying the video, please take a second and subscribe to the River Docs channel. Watch short documentary videos of your favorite rock, country, and blues bands and musicians from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Now, back to the video stream. Being a piano player in a three-guitar steamroller rock band is probably not the ideal situation you want to be in if you want to be noticed. And of course, with the guitar players writing most all of the music with some of the most iconic guitar riffs and solos ever, being the piano player, you better be one fine musician to fit in and bring those songs together. And Billy Powell did just that. I'll even go out on a limb here and say Billy was almost surely the single most technically accomplished musician in Lynyrd Skynyrd. He was classically trained and incredibly gifted, and I feel should be rated up there with some of the great rock pianists of the time. So I think it's about time that this channel shows Billy Powell some love and appreciation. William Norris Pyle was born a Texan on June 3, 1952. So how did he end up a Floridian? Well, his father was a naval aviator down in Corpus Christi, Texas. And while Billy was still a toddler, his father was reassigned to a Navy base in Italy, where the family was to join him later on. While in Italy, Billy's father died of cancer in 1960, and the Powells returned to the United States, where his mother, Marie, took a civilian job at the Naval Air Station in Jacksonville, Florida. His mother enrolled him south of Jacksonville at the Sanford Military Academy. This was a boarding school, and it's where Billy started getting interested in music. He started taking piano lessons while down there, but quickly outgrew his first teacher. As I said, he was very gifted and could pick up on songs very quickly. Billy came back to Jacksonville, found another piano teacher, and started taking lessons and enrolled at Bishop Kenny Catholic High School, which sat on the side of a shipyard during the World War II. It was around this time he was to become friends with Roy Simpson, who in turn introduced him to another boy named Leon Wilkeson. They became good friends. After graduating from Bishop Kenny in 1970, Billy enrolled in Jacksonville Community College as a music theory major, and it was around this time he started helping the Lynyrd Skynyrd band as a roadie. Now, as to how Billy went from roadie to become their piano player, there's a few different stories out there, but the one told by Gary Rossington sounds good and is probably pretty close to the truth. Gary said, Billy had been our roadie for a year or two, and we didn't know he even played piano. We just thought he was this goofy guy who helped us carry our amps around. Well, one night we were playing at Bayview High School, and after this gig it started raining so hard we couldn't load equipment. So we were all sitting in the gym waiting for the rain to quit so we could load up. Well, there was a piano there, and Billy just out of nowhere said, you know, if I ever had to play Freebird, this is the way I'd play it, and started playing it for about 5 or 10 minutes, just the way he plays it today. It was beautiful. We were all crying and just going on. We couldn't believe it. So we fired him that night from being our roadie and hired him to be our piano player. And the next gig, he played Freebird, and played 2 or 3 songs with us, and that's all he'd play, and then he'd be the roadie. So in the beginning, he became half keyboardist and half roadie, but pretty soon he just worked into a full-time piano player. Now most people refer to Billy as the keyboardist, but to me, he was more of a piano player who could play some organ and synthesizer. I think one of the most impressive things about Billy's playing, but even though he was trained in classical piano, he had a great feel for all styles of music, especially the blues and honky-tonk. The song most folks notice his piano work on is Freebird, but he took some monster solos on songs like I Know a Little, Call Me the Breeze, T for Texas. His playing on Tuesday's Gone and Sweet Home Alabama just pulled those songs together. So next time you're jamming out on some Skynyrd, just bend your ears a little bit away from those guitars and listen close to Billy. He was really a big part of the band and probably one of the best kept secrets of their sound. In the early years, Billy played the old Wurlitzer 44-key electric piano. Later on, after the band got big enough and would hire sound companies, he would start playing the Steinway 7-foot grand pianos. Now, Billy Powell used a Hammond B3 organ. The one that was painted white can be seen on the back cover of the Lynyrd Skynyrd live album, One More from the Road. And as I said earlier, I considered Billy more of a piano player than a keyboardist, but he was no slouch on that B3. Listen to Tuesday's Gone or Simple Man. Billy just seemed to have a natural feel of how to work them songs and make them flow. On a live performance of Saturday Night Special in 1976, Billy Powell can be seen playing a Yamaha SY2, showcasing its use alongside its usual Hammond B3. If anyone out there can add more to Billy's equipment list, feel free to jump in the comments section and enlighten us some more on the subject. In the studio during recording sessions, it was said Billy used to sit down and just play the song all the way through, and then the producers would go from there. He had an amazing sense of timing and rhythm. And one last note here, that badass solo he did on I Know a Little, one of the engineers who was working there that day says that Billy doubled that solo. For those not familiar with studio work, it means that the solo was played back to him and he would play the exact same thing over the top of the first one. I think of this every time I hear that song, and it reminds me of just how great Billy Powell was. Billy was one of the lucky ones, if you could call it that, whose injuries sustained in the 1977 plane crash were minimal compared to most of the survivors. He had some bad cuts on his face, and his nose was half torn off, and he did get a broken kneecap. But on crutches, he was able to attend the funerals of his fallen bandmates. Billy was the first member of the band to start playing again after the crash. He played on a couple of albums for 38 Special a few years after, and would get in a band with his old friend and bandmate Leon Wilkeson and drummer Artemis Pyle, and the band was called Alias. They'd release an album called Contraband, but it didn't do much at all. When after Alan Collins and Gary Rossington decided to put their group together, Billy was there all through that project. Then after Gary decided to leave, Billy stayed on to work with the Alan Collins Band. And in 1985, he would get into a Christian rock project called Visions. Again, Billy would be in that group with his old friend Leon Wilkeson. Then in 1987, talks of the 10-year anniversary of the plane crash tribute tour to honor the band started getting serious. Gary Rossington, who had formed the original band with lead singer Ronnie Van Zant, was initially reluctant to do the tour. He was, in the words of his wife Dale Kranz, still very emotional about the preceding events and about the anniversary of the plane crash. Eventually, Gary decided that if the tour was to be done right, and if his fallen colleagues were to be honored properly, that he should be involved. After that, it all came together very fast. And of course, Billy Powell was there, ready to go. The tour was only supposed to be a one-time thing for that year, but as most know, it still lives on today, although none of the original founding members are left. Billy Powell would stay with the Skynyrd Tribute Band until his death in 2009. Billy had been having heart problems and had skipped a doctor's appointment that week. A few days later, He was to call 911 complaining of chest pains and shortness of breath. Paramedics would arrive, but it was too late. Billy Powell was 56 years old. The cause of death was a heart attack. Billy was probably the quietest member of the band. You didn't hear much about him getting into fights, although there'd been a picture or two of him surface with a black eye. But for the most part, he was usually just sitting around drinking a beer and playing some of the finest piano you ever heard. Behind every successful band, there's usually a drummer who doesn't get noticed, and right beside the drummer stands a bass player who usually doesn't get the recognition he deserves either. In the case of Lynyrd Skynyrd, there were two drummers. One of them put the band on top, and the other one kept it there until the end. Now, I'm sure most of you know that I'm talking about Bob Burns and Artemis Pyle. Those two drummers, along with bassist Leon Wilkeson, laid down the foundation for some of the greatest songs and live shows in rock history. Although not a lot has been written about them, I feel it's time to give them their due. So kick back and enjoy the video as we get into the backbone of Lynyrd Skynyrd's rebel sound, talking Bob Burns and Artemis Pyle. Bob Burns was one of the founding members of Lynyrd Skynyrd, along with Alan Collins, Gary Rossington, Larry Johnstrom, and Ronnie Van Zant. He was the drummer on the band's Pronounced and Second Helping albums, which spawned many of the group's most timeless hits like Freebird, Simple Man, Gimme 3 Steps, and Sweet Home Alabama. Robert Louis Burns Jr. was born on November 24, 1950, in Gainesville, Florida. It was on Bob's parents' carport that the band first got together for a jam. The band would start out being called My Backyard, then the Noble Five and the 1%, before finally settling on Lynyrd Skynyrd. Bob told his story on meeting Ronnie and how the band got started. He said, "The way I met Ronnie, he knocked on my door one morning, right before school. I said, 'I don't want to fight you, man. You know?' And Ronnie said, 'I ain't here to fight.' He said, 'I'm a singer.' I said, 'You're a singer?' And he said, 'Yeah.' I said, 'I'll be dang.' I said, I got a bass player, and I had a guitar player. Why don't let's try and put something together?" This all started back in 1964. Now, they were just teenagers at the time, but as time went on, they kept at it. They started playing gigs with most of the boys still in high school, and Ronnie, being the oldest, working at an auto parts store. But as the 60s turned into the 70s, the band started getting serious. They added a second drummer in Ricky Medlock. Now, some people claim Ricky's an original member, and some don't. I named you my 5 original members, and that's what I stick with. Ricky joined the band sometime around May of 1971, and sometime around there, Bob left the group for a short period. Ricky, with Larry Johnstrom and Greg T. Walker both playing bass, recorded around 10 tracks at Muscle Shoals in July of 1971. Those demos or masters, whatever you wish to call them, were shelved and turned down by quite a few record companies. They were later released after the plane crash. Ricky would be off and on with the band for a time and finally go on with Greg T. Walker with the band Blackfoot. Ricky would join the Skynyrd Tribute Band in 1996 and is still with them today, doing a great job playing guitar. But in my opinion, as far as being an original member, I don't see it that way. And the comment section is open for you to express your feelings and thoughts on this subject. Bob Burns returned in January of 1972, and things would start to take off then. Leon Wilkeson was to be playing bass, and they kept working on more original music, much of which would make up the Pronounced album. But then Leon would leave, and this is where Ed King came in to take over on bass. Al Cooper had signed them to the Sounds of the South label, which was later acquired by MCA. With Bob back, there was a big improvement in the rhythm section, but by Ed's own admission, he had a lot of trouble playing and getting the proper feel to those bass lines Leon had played for all those songs. But Leon would soon return, and Ed moved over to guitar. Either way, the Pronounced album was a huge success. The album would end up going double platinum. Bob was to get his only songwriting credit on that album with the song Mississippi Kid. He said he's the one who gave it the name, and Ronnie gave him a songwriting credit. Bob Burns was to play on this album and the next album, Second Helping. But Bob had some mental issues. I've heard some say that he was just mentally fragile. And after watching the movie The Exorcist, he said it really drove him nuts. Gary Rossington said Bob thought a cat that was hanging around the hotel they were staying was possessed, and Bob proceeded to throw it out a window. But it was decided in 1974 that Bob would leave the group, that the touring and stress was just too much for him. So to replace him, Ronnie and the band chose Artemis Pyle. Artemis was born Thomas Delmer Pyle in 1948 in Louisville, Kentucky. How did he come by the nickname Artemis? He said he was going to Tennessee University in Cookeville, Tennessee, and everybody had nicknames like Snake, Woody, and Flash. He said a friend of mine, whose nickname was Snake, dubbed me Artemis because we were taking Greek mythology in one of my classes, and he came up with Artemis. I thought it was a girl's name, so I hated it. Then a show called The Wild Wild West came out with Artemis Gordon, and it was a guy, so I was okay with it after that. Following his time as a Marine Corps sergeant from 1967 to 1971, with a short stint in Spartansburg, South Carolina-based band Thickwood Lick, Artemis Pyle was recommended by Charlie Daniels and joined Lynyrd Skynyrd and replaced Bob Burns following the release of the group's second album, Second Helping. He would perform with the band on Skynyrd's subsequent 4 albums: Nothing Fancy, Give Me Back My Bullets, Street Survivors, and their live album, One More from the Road. In 1979, the band began to reunite after the 77 plane crash. First for the 5th annual Charlie Daniels Volunteer Jam, and eventually as a Rossington Collins band, which included all the remaining band members, plus Dale Kranz on lead vocals and Barry Lee Harwood on guitar. However, shortly after the band's inception, Artemis was in a motorcycle accident that broke his leg and shattered his hopes of remaining with the group. Pyle spent the next 3 years healing, both physically and emotionally. He would start out with the Skynyrd Tribute Tour in 1987 and stay with them about 4 years. Then he would go on to form the Artemis Pyle Band to honor the music and legacy of Ronnie Van Zant. Now let's shift gears here and talk about the changeover. Both Bob and Artemis fit the group very well, in my opinion. I didn't notice much of a change in the feel of the music or the live performances, no matter which drummer was playing. I have watched and listened to them play both separately and together on stage, and I can't say which one really fit the band best. Can you? The Skynyrd sound, and especially the rhythm section, never changed and stayed rock solid. And I do give a little credit to Leon Wilkeson for that. I know we're talking about the drummers here, but the rhythm section as a whole, you have to include the bass player in there too. Both Bob and Artemis always spoke highly of Leon and his playing. So since we're shifting gears here, let me take a minute and talk about Leon before we move on with Bob and Artemis, as Leon had a lot to do with this sound and both drummers. If ever a bass player fit his group, it was Leon Wilkeson. And by that I mean his playing set in the music so well. I know when listening to a Skynyrd song, it's hard to take your attention away from those ripping guitars of Collins, Rossington, King, or Gaines, or the lyrics and vocals of Ronnie Van Zant. But if you do, you'll hear a bass guitar that sets in the music and lays down the right feel needed for them guys to make those songs move. If you believe in destiny, then this guy was born to play bass guitar for Lynyrd Skynyrd. Leon Russell Wilkeson was born on April 2nd, 1952, in Newport, Rhode Island. Then the family moved to Jacksonville, Florida, soon after Leon was born. As a teenager, Leon's interest in the bass guitar started with the Beatles and Paul McCartney. He said he was also inspired by other bassists such as Jack Bruce and Barry Oakley. One of Leon's first bands was the Collegiates, along with Donnie Van Zant, who was Ronnie's younger brother and would go on to become the lead vocalist of the group 38 Special. Leon would then join a group called the King James Version. By this time, Leon was becoming well known around the Jacksonville area as one of the better bass players. And when Lynyrd Skynyrd was in need of one, he was ready. At least playing-wise he was. But at that time, he didn't seem to have his heart in it, because when Al Kooper signed the band and things were starting to take off, Leon did just that and headed back to Jacksonville in his job at the Farm Best Dairy Ice Cream Factory. I left the band and they hired Ed King from Strawberry Alarm Clock to play bass, and my lifelong buddy Billy Powell they brought in on piano. Ed King also did some guitar overdubbing during Pronounced. After they finished the album, they found out I was back in Jacksonville working at the ice cream factory. The guys sent Billy and Bob Burns over to drag me over to where Ronnie was fishing. They told me they had finished the Pronounced album and that Ed King really did not want to be a bass player. He wanted to play guitar, and that they did not have the time to look around for another bass player. So they wondered if I'd oblige them and come back. I said, "When do we start practicing?" Ronnie said, "I'll see you at rehearsal tomorrow." Out of all the band members who survived the 1977 plane crash, it was Leon who probably came the closest to dying from it. Backup singer Leslie Hawkins, who was put in the same ambulance as Leon, said she remembers seeing him going into convulsions. Leon suffered multiple injuries. Reports said he suffered massive internal injuries with 6 broken ribs and 1 puncturing his left lung, dislodged teeth, a broken nose, left arm, and leg. He lost a tremendous amount of blood, and after getting him to the hospital, his heart stopped twice on the operating table. The left arm injury was of particular concern. It was his fretting arm, and his wounds had gotten infected, nearly costing him an amputation of that arm. Even after he recovered, he had severe nerve damage and minimal range of motion in it, causing him to hold his bass guitar upright for the remainder of his playing days. He would get his guitars modified so he could hold them in an upright position, and it seemed to work well for him. The Mad Hatter of Southern rock was born to play bass for Lynyrd Skynyrd. Without him holding down that bottom end, the band would not have been the same. I rate Leon right up there with the likes of Barry Oakley and Phil Lesh. I've always thought that Leon was rock solid and always had tasteful lines and great tone. And you can say this about Bob and Artemis also. Without those two guys on the bottom end, Skynyrd would never have been the same. Bob Burns created the driving beats on those first 2 albums and could take them right to the stage and keep the band rocking. Bob was a funny guy also. Many of the band's members remember him as the Joker, as he kept them all laughing all the time. He was a very important piece to the Skynyrd puzzle in the early years. Those songs on the Pronounced album might have had a different feel had it not been for Bob's playing style and drive. When Artemis took over for Bob, he did a great job live getting those early songs down and keeping the band's sound intact. His playing on the live One More from the Road album proves that. He was also creative in his beats when in the studio. Bob and Artemis were both elected to the Hall of Fame as members of Lynyrd Skynyrd. Both of them contributed to the band's sound, and both were the perfect fit. I never saw one as being better than the other. Like their bass player, Leon Wilkeson, they just fit the mold. If ever a bass player fit his group, it was Leon Wilkeson. And by that I mean his playing set in the music so well. I know when listening to a Skynyrd song, it's hard to take your attention away from those ripping guitars of Collins, Rossington, King, or Gaines, or the lyrics and vocals of Ronnie Van Zant. But if you do, you'll hear a bass guitar that sets in the music and lays down the right feel needed for them guys to make those songs move. If you believe in destiny, then this guy was born to play bass guitar for Lynyrd Skynyrd. So let's take a quick look back on a guy who I feel deserves a little of the spotlight for all those great Skynyrd songs, bassist Leon Wilkeson. Leon Russell Wilkeson was born on April 2nd, 1952, in Newport, Rhode Island. Then the family moved to Jacksonville, Florida, soon after Leon was born. As a teenager, Leon's interest in the bass guitar started with the Beatles and Paul McCartney. He said he was also inspired by other bassists such as Jack Bruce and Barry Oakley. One of Leon's first bands was the Collegiates, along with Donnie Van Zant, who was Ronnie's younger brother and would go on to become the lead vocalist of the group 38 Special. Leon would then join a group called the King James Version. By this time, Leon was becoming well known around the Jacksonville area as one of the better bass players. And when Lynyrd Skynyrd was in need of one, he was ready. At least playing-wise he was. But at that time, he didn't seem to have his heart in it, because when Al Kooper signed the band and things were starting to take off, Leon did just that and headed back to Jacksonville in his job at the Farm Best Dairy Ice Cream Factory. Why Leon backed out could be anybody's guess. There are a few different stories, but taking everything into consideration, I myself think he was a bit apprehensive and just wasn't ready to take that final step. The recordings that were done in Muscle Shoals and the time sure seemed right, but Leon got cold feet and stepped back. So now enter Ed King. Ed had crossed paths with the band a few times, and when Ronnie gave him a call, it wasn't to play guitar, but bass guitar. Ed says it was hard to fit in, as he didn't feel his bass playing fit in with their style of music. So he had an awkward time, as he put it. But once in, he took to the long, hot rehearsals at the famed Hell House. Also included in his initiation into the band, during his first week, he had to spend the nights at Hell House to keep anyone from stealing their equipment. He said it was hot and a bit noisy from all the alligators. Now, Ed King was a good bass player, but even he knew he didn't have the feel it took, and after the Pronounced album was recorded, the call went back out to Leon. Here's how he describes how he was asked to come back to the band. I left the band, and they hired Ed King from Strawberry Alarm Clock to play bass, and my lifelong buddy Billy Powell they brought in on piano. Ed King also did some guitar overdubbing during Pronounced. After they finished the album, they found out I was back in Jacksonville working at the ice cream factory. The guys sent Billy and Bob Burns over to drag me over to where Ronnie was fishing. They told me they had finished the Pronounced album and that Ed King really did not want to be a bass player. He wanted to play guitar, and that they did not have the time to look around for another bass player. So they wondered if I'd oblige them and come back. I said, "When do we start practicing?" Ronnie said, "I'll see you at rehearsal tomorrow." Now what made Leon agree on the spot, who knows, but he was back in for good. As far as the Pronounced album, as to who played what, many different stories on that. Here, as I've done before, we'll just go by what's wrote on the album notes itself. It reads, Ed King lead guitar on Mississippi Kid. Bass on all tracks except Mississippi Kid and Tuesday's Gone. Leon Wilkeson, bass for the group until the album was cut. Rejoined shortly thereafter. Composed many of the bass parts played on the album by Ed. Now feel free to use the comments section to chime in on the Pronounced and the Muscle Shoals album. As I said in the intro, Leon's style fit the Skynyrd group to a T. But one thing I think goes unnoticed about him was his harmony vocals. Leon was a solid harmony singer. His voice was a good fit, and his phrasing was right there with Ronnie. Leon was a very important piece to the Lynyrd Skynyrd group. Now here's a little fun fact about Leon, who was named Leon Russell Wilkeson. Now I read a few articles saying he was named after pianist Leon Russell. Now that's impossible, because Leon Russell was born Claude Russell Bridges, and he didn't change his name until he was 17 years old when he moved out to California. Now Leon Wilkeson would have been 7 years old at that time. But here's a true fact. Leon Wilkeson and Leon Russell share the same birthday of April 2nd. They were born exactly 10 years apart. Wilkeson in 1952 and Russell in 1942. Out of all the band members who survived the 1977 plane crash, it was Leon who probably came the closest to dying from it. Backup singer Leslie Hawkins, who was put in the same ambulance as Leon, said she remembers seeing him going into convulsions. Leon suffered multiple injuries. Reports said he suffered massive internal injuries with 6 broken ribs and 1 puncturing his left lung, dislodged teeth, a broken nose, left arm, and leg. He lost a tremendous amount of blood, and after getting him to the hospital, his heart stopped twice on the operating table. The left arm injury was of particular concern. It was his fretting arm, and his wounds had gotten infected, nearly costing him an amputation of that arm. Even after he recovered, he had severe nerve damage and minimal range of motion in it, causing him to hold his bass guitar upright for the remainder of his playing days. He would get his guitars modified so he could hold them in an upright position, and it seemed to work well for him. One of the biggest mysteries and controversial Skynyrd stories was how Leon ended up with his throat cut on the tour bus after a show. There's a lot of speculation as to what happened, and I'm going to lean a little to the story told by guitarist Ed King, who was there and found him that morning bleeding in his bunk. This happened in the early 90s in Nashville, Tennessee. Ed said Leon had been really drunk the night before, as he had went to pick up his girlfriend Rhonda at the airport, and her plane was 5 hours late. So Leon passed the time at the airport bar. He says Leon was so drunk at the show that night that he couldn't play very well at all, and most of the band members were pretty pissed off at him. After the show, most of the guys flew back to Jacksonville, except for Ed, Randall Hall, Leon, and Rhonda. Early in the morning, Ed said he woke up and walked to the front to talk to the driver. On the way back to the rear, he noticed Leon's arm dangling out of his bunk and some blood dripping from it. On further examination, Leon's throat had been cut and he was laying there in a pool of blood with Rhonda. They took him straight to the hospital and had him stitched up. Leon told Ed he'd stumbled and must have cut himself in the bus hallway. There was also reports Ed himself had cut Leon's throat. That one I find hard to believe. Ed never really drank and left the band the first time because of all the violence. Rhonda? Maybe. Or like Leon said, he was trashed and could very well have stumbled into something on the bus and cut his own throat. This one's anybody's guess, and you can add more to the story in the comments section if you feel the urge. Leon was found dead in his hotel room in Florida, July 27, 2001. He was 49 years old. Many friends say he had been clean and sober for 18 months prior to his death. According to the autopsy report, Leon's death was accidental and the official cause of death was listed as complications of emphysema associated with positional asphyxia. He also had severe cirrhosis of the liver. The report also stated that Leon was prescribed medication for insomnia, chronic pain, as well as anxiety. You can see here there was some pretty heavy medication found in him. And yes, there are still some saying he was murdered. The Mad Hatter of Southern rock was born to play bass for Lynyrd Skynyrd. Without him holding down that bottom end, the band would not have been the same. I rate Leon right up there with the likes of Barry Oakley and Phil Lesh. I've always thought that Leon was rock solid and always had tasteful lines and great tone. Feel free to leave your Leon thoughts and stories in the comments section. And as always, thanks for watching and supporting the channel. If you're enjoying the video, please take a second and subscribe to the River Docs channel. Watch short documentary videos of your favorite rock, country, and blues bands and musicians from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Now, back to the video stream. The Honkettes was the name given to the female backup singers of the southern rock group Lynyrd Skynyrd. From left to right, as they took their places on stage, were Leslie Hawkins, Cassie Gaines, and JoJo Billingsley. They were hired individually in November and December of 1975. Each one of them had their own distinctive voice, which they would blend together in sweet harmonies, creating the perfect backup sound around some of Lynyrd Skynyrd's iconic songs. The Honkettes were brought together, created and named by founding member, singer-songwriter Ronnie Van Zant. JoJo Billingsley was hired without Ronnie even hearing her sing. Ronnie looked at her and said, "She'll do just fine." Ronnie always had an uncanny knack of hiring members and making musical adjustments in the group that worked. This is just another of many. So let's see if we can sift through all the Lynyrd Skynyrd folklore, go over what it had to say, and give these girls a little of the spotlight in this video. Leslie Hawkins was first hired by Skynyrd in November of 1975. She also had the most professional experience of the three girls, as she had been doing recording sessions and working with the band Wet Willie and singer Billy Joe Royal. She was the one with the high soprano voice. At the time she was hired, she lived and worked around the Jacksonville, Florida area. Cassie Gaines was raised in Miami, Oklahoma, and had what many called a Broadway voice. Cassie ended up landing a part in the stage production of Hairspray. It would later go on to become a Broadway musical and win 8 Tony Awards. She worked as a waitress in Memphis, Tennessee while going to school at MSU for arts and drama. It was there she would meet Deborah Jo Billingsley, who also worked at the same restaurant as a waitress. They became friends as both of them was passionate about singing. Deborah Jo Billingsley, later known as JoJo, was born in Memphis, Tennessee, and raised up just 40 miles south of there in Senatobia, Mississippi. She was the girl with the gravel and whiskey in her voice. Her name was pitched to Lynyrd Skynyrd for the backup singer's gig by a friend who ran lights for Skynyrd and Fleetwood Mac. When she got a call from a Skynyrd sound tech to go see a concert in Nashville, she went. And after the show, she was invited backstage, where she met Ronnie Van Zant, who hired her on the spot before he ever heard her sing. Deborah Jo, after she was hired, would remember Cassie Gaines and her love for singing, and she would be the one who recommended her to Van Zant, even though she had never really heard Cassie sing before. In 1975, Lynyrd Skynyrd stayed busy touring and working on the Gimme Back My Bullets album. Ed King had left the group, and to be honest here, the group wasn't keeping up. Blame it on burnout, over-partying, or just bad management, the band was slipping. Ronnie Van Zant saw this and knew something needed to be done. So he decided to add some icing to the cake. He hired the girl backup singers. Now Ronnie didn't find a group of girls who had worked together. He put one together himself, and later on he would name them the Honkettes. But at first, they were just hired individual singers as part of the group. How he did this is really pretty amazing. Each had a different style voice, but when you listen to them on tape or live, the blend of their voices is fantastic. They started touring with the band in early 1976. I'm guessing their first show with the group was on or around February 6, as JoJo Billingsley said that they had a few rehearsals at their studio in Jacksonville, Florida, and then they were off to England to tour. She went on to say that they went to the British Isles and then over to Glasgow, Scotland. And in January, Skynyrd had 10 shows booked here in the U.S., the last show being on the 24th in Texas. Then 2 weeks off before performing again, which was February 6th in Manchester, England. So the girls was probably worked in during that 2 weeks off and started as soon as they got over to England. And right before they left, the band's fourth studio album, Gimme Back My Bullets, was released. Now, I don't know for sure what happened here, but the album just didn't do real well at all. It took it 5 years before ever reaching gold status. It hit number 20 on the charts but faded away. The producer on the album was one of the best in Tom Dowd, and the boys really liked him. Dowd also brought in some female backup singers to add to the sound. They were credited as the Honkettes. On the original release of Gimme Back My Bullets, there were no tracks sung by the Honkettes, as some people tend to think. They did re-release the album with a couple of bonus live tracks that the Honkettes did sing on and are credited for as such. But there is no Leslie, Cassie, or JoJo on the original Gimme Back My Bullets album. I don't know if the low sales of the album had anything to do with it or not, but the band, besides adding the girls, were also looking for that third guitarist to take the place of Ed King, who had left the year before. And he came in the form of newly hired Cassie Gaines's younger brother, Steve. Cassie had been pestering Ronnie about hearing her brother play, and Ronnie kept blowing her off until she finally had Steve come up for a gig in Kansas City, and the guys relented and let him on stage to jam out a number. That song was T for Texas. Steve slipped the slide on his finger. Ronnie heard him play through a solo and looked at the girls who were standing behind the amp line and simply said, "This is number 3. Ronnie made up his mind on the spot, and again, he was right on with his choice. If you want to know more about Steve's life and his hiring on with Skynyrd, I have a video on him on the channel. I'll put a link up right here, and it'll get you there. By this time, the girls had their vocal parts nailed down, and along with guitarist Steve Gaines, who was hired on May 11th, this really seemed to light a fuse under the band, and in a short time they were ready to record what I consider one of the best live rock and roll albums ever, One More from the Road. It was recorded at the Fox Theater in Atlanta over 3 shows, July 7th, 8th, and 9th of 1976. Listening to the album, the Honkettes really shined. Besides doing backup with Ronnie, they had JoJo worked in on some of the harmony parts, along with bass player Leon Wilkeson. I think adding the girls, along with getting back to the 3-guitar sound, jump-started the band, and at this point in time was probably the best they ever sounded. So the party rolled on into 1977. In April of that year, they'd start to work on the Street Survivor album. The Honkettes on the album cover is credited with singing backups on the song That Smell, and Leslie got credit on her part of the song One More Time. The album would be released on October 17th, just 3 days before that fateful plane crash that ended it all. Earlier, Ronnie had hired his longtime friend, Gene Odom, to help take care of the band. Ronnie and Gene went back a long way and were childhood friends and fishing buddies. And Gene wasn't a drinker or a smoker, and Ronnie felt they needed to try and get the band to straighten up, himself included. All of the members, including the Honkettes, were still partying hard before, during, and after the shows. This had been a Skynyrd tradition, and it never really stopped. Now, JoJo Billingsley was not on the plane when it crashed. The reason why is, she said she went home and was trying to clean up. She was physically and mentally sick, but that Ronnie had called her and asked her to come back and meet them in Greenville, South Carolina, which is where the plane took off from before heading over to Baton Rouge when it crashed in Mississippi. She said she heard a voice tell her while she was on the phone to Ronnie to wait. She did, saying she would come back and meet up with him in a few days later in Little Rock, Arkansas. And then she dreamed the plane crashed, which it did. But there's some who say that Ronnie had actually fired JoJo from the group, and that he was planning to get rid of all the girls because it was causing problems within the band. What were those reasons? Well, there's not enough time to cover them all in this video, so I'll just say, I take any story I hear and read about Lynyrd Skynyrd with a grain or two of salt, and when it comes to sex, drugs, booze, and rock and roll, I do know anything is possible. JoJo stuck to her story until her death in 2010. The comment section's open, and you all can have your say about it there. Cassie Gaines was killed in the plane crash. She wasn't killed instantly, and the story told by piano player Billy Powell was that he was with her and she was bleeding severely from her wounds and died before help could get there. Leslie Hawkins survived the crash, although it took her years to recover from her injuries. She still has issues with them even today. She suffered a concussion, 3 cervical fractures, and facial injuries requiring plastic surgery. She was partially paralyzed and suffered permanent neurological damage. Her insurance premium was not paid for some reason at the office of Skynyrd, and Leslie was left with major hospital bills to pay and unable to work. She's pretty much kept quiet about her days with Skynyrd. She did say that her and Cassie were close during the time the group was going. The amazing thing about the Honkettes is that they'd never sang together before, and were brought together, and just like the Skynyrd boys, they seemed to have a chemistry up there, blending their voices and backing up Ronnie Van Zant's vocals. It was a perfect fit, and it didn't take them long to get it all together with their voices. I always enjoyed watching and listening to the Honkettes. I can't say I had a favorite. They were all good looking and all had great voices. They worked the stage well and seemed to be that icing on the cake that Ronnie was looking for in their shows. So no matter what Ronnie Van Zant was going for at the time, looks or talent, I say he got both and then some, putting the Honkettes together. As always, feel free to leave comments and your thoughts and some of your Honkette stories. If you haven't subscribed, please do and hit the thumbs up button. Helps the channel grow. Thanks for watching.